Well, if you're going to talk about CIA, scandals at the CIA, I'm not sure that you could find a better guest than my friend Mike Benz, Executive Director of the Foundation for Freedom Online. He has exposed so much, it's jaw-dropping at this point in time. Okay, Mike, before we get into the scandals, we have so destroyed the intelligence operations in this country that people don't even really understand what CIA is supposed to do. What are they supposed to do?
Well, the CIA is supposed to be a plausibly deniable support organization for the U.S. Department of State on national interest grounds and the U.S. Department of Defense on national security grounds, which is a long way of saying that in 1948, when the rules-based international order was set up, we needed a way for the State Department to operate a cloak and dagger plausibly deniable black ops shop in order to do the sorts of things that would cause a diplomatic scandal if it turned out the U.S. government was responsible for. So the U.S. government needed a way to make things happen without looking like the U.S. government did it. And that's when it's State Department related, that's usually on U.S. economic grounds or political grounds. And when the CIA work is related to military, it's usually involving paramilitary groups or terrorist groups or other unseemly factions that we are providing military support to. So there's both a political and a military component to what the CIA is supposed to do. The problem is because they are a professional political subversive organization, literally set up to inaugurate organized political warfare. That's the exact term that George Kennan used in his 1948 memo, the inauguration of organized political warfare, to give the CIA its remit. That political warfare can boomerang back on Americans when the U.S. foreign policy establishment thinks that Americans are domestically going to vote for someone who will undermine their preferred foreign policy agenda. That's what you saw in the 1960s when the CIA was playing around at home to influence left-wing groups to stop the anti-Vietnam War movement. That's what you're seeing today as the CIA is working to basically do the same thing to the right wing when it comes to the anti-war or the nationalist rather than globalist wing of the Republican Party.
Now, 1948 to the 60s is not by any stretch of the imagination a long period of time, Mike. So why did they face inward so quickly, or did they really just face inward from the very beginning?
Well, you could argue that they did from the very beginning. I think it was that the 1960s is when there really was a break in the bipartisan consensus when it came to the construction of the American empire. There was a fair amount of optimism from the late 1940s into the early 1960s about the purpose of American statecraft and establishing America as the global hegemon in the face of the Cold War with Russia. In the 1960s, the rise of the civil rights movement, the rise of third world peoples movements and anti-imperialist movements, also influenced to some degree by the popularity of Marxism in U.S. universities, led to a breaking of the Republican-Democrat consensus as this ascendant coalition within the Democrats pushed against U.S. interventionism around the world and pushed against the war in Vietnam. And then that resulted in scandals during the CIA's history. Starting in the early 1960s, there was something called Operation Chaos, which was a big disaster for the CIA when it was revealed the CIA was personally intervening in campus politics by sponsoring groups like the National Students Association to effectively bribe young people to write counter propaganda against the harder left faction. The CIA was busted constructing front groups like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, where they were taking high-level U.S. musicians, writers, thought leaders, poets, visual artists, musical artists into a sort of CIA artist club. This included not just classical musicians, jazz musicians, writers from high-level magazines, but also feminist thought leaders like Gloria Steinem. And this was all Gloria Steinem herself would later describe her role in the CIA-sponsored Congress for Cultural Freedom as saying that the reason it was so important for the CIA to focus on culture was because you can think of culture as permanent politics. The kind of when culture is established, it sets the boundaries for what politics can and can't do. And so a group like the CIA, whose role is political subversion, first and foremost, sets its sights on control over the culture, which sets the bounds for the politics. During that same period in the 1960s and 70s, the CIA was busted in other scandals like assassinations of foreign leaders. They assassinated the president of Congo, Lumumba. They assassinated Allende in Chile. They were busted with constructing assassination weapons like the heart attack gun that was held up by Senator Frank Church in the Church Committee hearings. They were busted in scandals like MK Ultra, which involved effectively behavioral modification programs, both at the individual and at the group level, to be able to control the psychology of both individuals and political groups. All of this came to a head in 1975 and 1976 during the Church Committee hearings, which established, for the first time in U.S. history, a Senate Intelligence Committee and a House Intelligence Committee to be able to have congressional oversight of the rogue CIA. Jimmy Carter rode to power in 1976 on the back of all this left-wing resentment against the CIA. He went to war with the CIA. He fired 30% of the CIA's operations wing in a single night, 30% in a single night. It was called the Halloween Massacre because it was done on October 31st. He then crippled the CIA's budget and put a CIA director in, Stansfeld Turner, who was basically like the left-wing Kash Patel for the New Left Democrats, who basically put huge bumper cars on what the CIA couldn't do. At the time, in the 1970s, Bill Barr was working for the CIA. Bill Barr would go on to be the Attorney General of the United States twice, including during Trump's term. Bill Barr wrote in his biography that he had wanted to become, he told his high school guidance counselor that he wanted to run the CIA, be the director of the CIA when he grew up. He then worked for the CIA directly out of college and went to law school at George Washington University Knight School. He went to Knight Law School while he worked for the CIA. And he said that he only decided he didn't want to run the CIA when Stansfeld Turner under Jimmy Carter took power and put the reins on what the CIA couldn't do. Basically, as soon as Bill Barr encountered a CIA leadership who wanted to restrain its cloak and dagger dark arts powers, Bill Barr said he lost interest in running the CIA at that point, which I think is just kind of funny. But that then led to Ronald Reagan's tenure in the early 1980s. He, of course, came to power on the back of the Iran hostage situation, which the intelligence community in the U.S. argued would have been prevented if the CIA had had its old powers back. So Ronald Reagan quickly went to work trying to get the CIA's old powers back, but ran into a Democrat-controlled Congress who wouldn't let it happen. So he then put the intelligence community through a reorganization that we still live through today, where he basically diffused the CIA's old powers into a pair of institutions, USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, so that just as the CIA was created to give a layer of plausible deniability to the State Department, USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy became the main plausible deniability layer for the CIA. So it was pushed into this NGO layer. And so I think several of the scandals we're going to be talking about today are at that diffused layer rather than directly at CIA. It's at the CIA liaised rather than CIA run layer, which is where most of CIA work happens nowadays.
Which brings us to the first of the scandals, the fake vaccination drive. What did they do?
Yeah, this was a major international scandal. So in 2011, the CIA set up a hepatitis vaccine clinic. They set up a ring of these in Pakistan, and they publicly advertised this to the Pakistani people that these clinics existed in order to vaccinate the local population against hepatitis in the face of USAID promulgated media that there was a hepatitis outbreak in Pakistan, so everyone needed to get vaccinated. But it turns out it was actually, these were all fake vaccination clinics. The CIA was only luring people into these vaccine clinics in order to collect their biometrics. Now, the official story, as bad as that is, as bad as the official story is, officially, when the CIA got busted in this, basically Pakistani intelligence noticed that there was a lot of strange goings on at these vaccine clinics and ultimately discovered that the whole thing was a U.S. intelligence operation that the U.S. later confessed to maintain relations with the Pakistani government and publicly apologized for duping everyone with these fake vaccine clinics. They said the only reason we did it is because we were looking for Osama bin Laden, and so we were collecting everyone's biometric and DNA information. They were basically, they had a blood sample of the Osama bin Laden family because Osama bin Laden's sister had recently died in Boston. And so they collected her blood and they tried to collect basically the blood of everyone in Pakistan to identify their way to the up to the Osama bin Laden family. But of course, even that cover story, as scandalous as that is on its own, I think is quite a whopper of a lie unto itself. You see, as this was playing out, David Petraeus had announced in a doctrine that he called identity dominance, which was part of U.S. counterinsurgency doctrine, that they were having a problem with being able to contain guerrilla, anonymous group activity where people were showing up in large crowds in protests. It was hard to be able to pinpoint in targeted strikes all of the troublemakers in the area. So they wanted to collect the biometric data and the biological data of what they said was 85% of the population in Iraq, in Syria, in Pakistan, in all of these Central Asian conflict zones. And so while the U.S. military had announced that they wanted 85% of the country's DNA and eyeballs so that they would be able to have identity dominance and pick out basically anyone in a crowd, be able to instantly ID anyone who was a troublemaker, they were running these vaccine clinics in order to collect that, which I think if they were busted in Pakistan, there's an open question of how many vaccine clinics were playing this role around the world. You know, there's a lot of terrorist groups. There's terrorist groups in Africa. There's terrorist groups in Eastern Europe. There's terrorist groups in South America. How many of these public health facilities have been operating as CIA fronts? Adjacent to that, in 2014, so that was under the Obama administration. Also under the Obama administration in 2014, the CIA was busted running a fake HIV/AIDS clinic, which was set up nominally to help solve the HIV breakouts in Cuba. And it turned out that those clinics were actually operating as a paramilitary transport hub where the U.S. was sending weapons and paramilitaries into Cuba under the front of a AIDS clinic. So you see these public health facilities that are held up in foreign countries, and yet they're operating as intelligence and paramilitary fronts because no one would think to look at a vaccine clinic or an HIV clinic as a hub of CIA activity, and so it's allowed to go on for years. But how many other countries have they done this in if they've been caught there?
I can't help with all this talk about vaccines think back to COVID. Did what they do have any impact on how that propaganda was pushed here, do you think?
Well, it's hard not to see it. And in fact, it's not just that it was the same sort of playbook in a certain way, because what came along with COVID vaccines, was contact tracing. Everything, all of your phone data, everything moving into the QR codes. They contemporaneously rolled out at DHS, under which TSA is tucked, mandatory eyeball scanning in domestic travel. So the same way that U.S. Marines used to go around in Iraq and Syria and Pakistan lifting up people's eyeballs all over the country in order to snap a picture so that the U.S. military would have their eyeballs in a database. So anytime they showed up on a drone camera participating in a protest activity against U.S. government operations, every single hostile adversary to the State Department could be ID'd in terms of who they are and where they live. The same thing did indeed come home under the COVID era. There's only the question now of what exactly they're doing with that data, but undeniably they have collected it. But I would like to point out one other aspect of this, which is that Henry Kissinger in 2000, who was the U.S. Secretary of State, as well as National Security Advisor, U.S. Secretary of State is this sort of symphony orchestra conductor of CIA operations. The CIA answers most directly to the State Department because they are nominally it's the National Security Council, but because they serve the State Department, they have to synchronize with the State Department. So the State Department reads all the CIA analyst memos and coordinates the covert activity in the region so that it's in sync with the overt action being done by the State Department. And so Henry Kissinger is a very senior figure who looms large over the CIA's evolution in the 20th century. In the year 2000, he wrote a book, and the final chapter of the book includes a blueprint for the 21st century. And he talks about the importance of humanitarian interventions as a modality to project U.S. soft power because of its success in the 1990s in giving U.S. intelligence access to places they would not have access to if they did it under the banner of national security or military intervention. And he gives the examples of Cuba, Haiti, several African countries, and Yugoslavia, basically talking about how these public health structure hubs and these poverty relief programs and these all these different humanitarian expenditures of U.S. aid money to build up institutions in foreign countries, ostensibly to help the poor or the sick, were an extremely effective method to gain political control over 7 to 10 different countries over the 1990s. And Henry Kissinger called for a radical upscaling of that capacity in the 21st century in order to continue the momentum they had just had over overthrowing the government of Yugoslavia and balkanizing Yugoslavia into Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Kosovo. And so Dr. Peter Hotez actually started out his career as Hotez, who would become this very senior, almost spokesman figure during the COVID era. Folks remember he's the kind of crazy doctor with the frizzy hair and the bow tie who's sort of like a discount Bill Nye the Science Guy, but for the Pentagon, and working out of this strange lab at Baylor University, and the guy who wrote a whole book about how anti-vaxxers should be treated like terrorists, and that no one should be debating anti-COVID or vaccine skeptical or lockdown skeptics on Joe Rogan. He famously turned down all these debate requests because he was afraid of getting blown out, but his covers, he didn't want to legitimize them. Well, in 2004, this was 20 years, I guess 15 years before COVID broke out. In 2004, Dr. Peter Hotez began writing a series of articles that he called Vaccines as Instruments of Foreign Policy. And everyone can look this up. They're published on PubMed. He wrote about 5 articles on this topic. And he specifically cites Henry Kissinger's book in 2000. And he, as a doctor, as a medical professional, says we need to double and triple down on vaccine diplomacy because it's a useful instrument of U.S. statecraft to be able to project U.S. soft power into foreign countries by establishing a hub of influence under cover of public health. He says vaccines, basically, whether they work or not, they get you in the door. You now have a U.S. money pumping through the veins of that economy. These institutions can then put pressure on the local governments in the same way that Pfizer puts pressure on our media ecosystem here, our advertising networks. Pfizer funds politicians. Once you get the money in and the hubs of influence built up, then it doesn't really matter if the vaccines work or not. They have a dual use. And so Peter Hotez wrote that in 2004, and then he continued to write about that topic for the rest of his career, and he comes out as the leading, spokesman in many respects, other than Anthony Fauci himself and a handful of little mini czars. But then you see the strange role of the CIA throughout all of COVID. That the Wuhan lab was actually funded to the tune of $15 million by U.S. aid, which is one of the most frequent CIA cutouts. And we'll be talking, I think, about U.S. aid and some of these other scandals. You had Avril Haines, who was the deputy director of the CIA, who took part in the Event 201 pre-planning exercise just 2 months before COVID broke out. Avril Haines, who is now Biden's director of national intelligence, she was the deputy director of the CIA, the number 2 of Obama's CIA, who gave a whole panel dissertation at Event 201 on the importance of pre-censoring anyone who, on media or social media, who questioned the origins of this mystery outbreak in this hypothetical exercise about a coronavirus breaking out in China in October 2019, 2 months before the breakout of a coronavirus in China in December 2019 that would go on to be called COVID-19. You have the initial censorship all being done by these CIA front groups like Graphica, whose chief strategy officer worked for 25 years from the CIA and who was incubated in the Minerva Initiative, which is the U.S. Department of Defense's Psychological Operations Research Center. So that was the first organization to begin censoring COVID-19 narratives online. They started that work right as the outbreak happened. December 16th is when their own documents say they started doing their censorship work. And so the whole thing was laced with CIA top to bottom. Now, it's unclear whether that was just simply to contain the scandal of a military-generated coronavirus from these, the DARPA grants in 2018 that created the capacity for these foreign cleavage sites and the jumping from bat to human. But the fact is the CIA is all over that story, just like they were all over the fake vaccine clinics in Pakistan and the fake HIV clinics in Cuba. But it really begs the question of, when you look at the size of the public health sector, that it's, most of U.S. expenditures are spent on public health. We have this vast apparatus in Africa, this vast apparatus in Eastern Europe, this vast public health apparatus in Central Asia, this vast public health apparatus in the Western Hemisphere and South America. How many, if these are just the ones they got busted for, and these are professional intelligence agencies and organizations whose job is to hide this, if they've been busted twice, are there 200 of these that they haven't been busted in? How much of the economy, how much of the economic lifeblood is serving as a sort of protected soft power influence for U.S. intelligence?
Good grief. Okay, let's get to number 2 here. CIA,
look at Donald Rumsfeld.
Speaking of Cuba.
Well, sorry, last thing, if I can just get this out. Donald Rumsfeld, who was George Bush's Secretary of Defense, the head of the entire U.S. military. What was he doing right before he became the head of the Secretary of War? He was a pharmaceutical bro. He was running Gilead. He was the CEO of it, which is the same organization that would come back with these COVID pharmaceutical treatments. And it was run by Donald Rumsfeld. So once again, it's the military and medicine.
I would thank you for coming to my YouTube channel, but I know how brilliant it is, and I know you love it here. So subscribe and watch. We're going to start really ramping things up and putting some funny stuff, some interesting stuff out there, some collaborations. Either way, my YouTube channel is officially the place to be. So stick around.